Of course, the problem that auctions always revealed is how imperfect everyone's information is. Maybe you can tell by looking at a cow which one's better than the other. Maybe you can tell by sniffing a loaf of bread which one's better than the other. But maybe you can't. And maybe there are people who are really good at it and people who are terrible at it. And so there are a lot of anxieties that come up around auctions about what kind of information do we have, and is someone trying to trick us?
Hi, thanks for joining us on Minds Over Matters. Today's guest is historian Ellen Hartigan-O'Connor. Her new book, America Under the Hammer, details how auctions establish the foundations for our modern economic system by allowing the people to collectively set a price for anything for sale. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. Stick around. Your work has to do with auctions and how value is set. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when I was reading about your work, the correlation escaped me, and then when I read it, it made all the sense in the world. So I really want to hear from you, who've studied this extensively, what this all means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe a place to start is to ask, what do we think a concept like value measures, right? Does it measure how much we love something? I value it. Does it measure how much work was put into something, right? The labor value. Does it measure the price we paid for it? The value was what I paid, and I paid its value. And we have all these meanings when we talk about value, and people in the past had all these meanings as well. And so they were grappling with these ideas about value and how it might be linked to exchange, how it might be linked to economies in kind of fundamental ways that are different from the world we live in now. So I study the 18th century in British North America, and what people may not realize is the prices of things in British North America were not determined by what we might call, cause an exchange, right? Many of them were set by the government, so there could be a fair price that could be a legal thing. There could be a customary price. There could even be what's seen as a God-given price or intrinsic value to things. And so as people in new colonial settings are encountering new kinds of social relations, new kinds of goods, new kinds of ideas about ownership, they're debating how might they link all these ideas about value to some form of exchange. And auctions emerge. Auctions had existed in other places, but auctions emerge as a particularly useful tool for working out what is value and how do we link it to exchange.
So with the exception of the government scenarios that you just alluded to, it was like the power of the people. This is what we're willing to pay. The community decided what the value of a thing would be because that's how much they were willing to part with for it.
Well, that's one definition of value, right? How much people are willing to pay for what it is. And let me give an example that might be helpful. So as we transition from an idea of customary prices, so for example, a bushel of wheat is at this price. That's how much you pay. If you're a seller and you charge more than that, you're breaking the law because that's not what the cost is. So that's an older conception of sometimes called a moral economy, a set price because that way people can get wheat, they can live, they can eat their daily bread. A newer idea is, well, let's see how much we can get for it, right? Let's test this and see what's the proper price. So an example that comes out in court cases is often somebody will sue somebody else, and there's a dispute over how much the debtor owes the creditor. And in the earlier period, so the beginning of the 18th century, there would usually be a reference to a customary price. This could be set, or it could be by law, or it could be by common practice, right? By the late 18th and early 19th century, there are explicit references to auction prices. Auction prices as being the right price and the fair price. And the reason people by the late 18th, early 19th century think that the auction price is a good thing, is right, isn't breaking the law, is fair, is these ideas that are linked to auctions around competition. So number one, that it's open, so anyone can see it, which means it wasn't decided by some powers that be in secret. It was all out there. So people were willing to pay or not willing to pay. Their neighbors sat there and either let them bid or prevented them from bidding. So it's open in that way. And the other is the idea that competition somehow produces a fair price. That if you have people head to head, picking numbers, that the result of that dynamic is a fair one, is a just one. And those are ideas that we live with today. I mean, we still believe in that that's the way exchange should work. That's the way we should value things. But it takes time for that kind of marketization to emerge, and it isn't the only way.
And so did that lead to like stratification of products? Like you just touched on something like maybe there's someone whose cows are traditionally better, for food or better for milking or something like that. And then so, Fred's cows are going to always sell for more, Frank's cows, not so much or something like that. So, and then that's an incentive for the manufacturers or the providers to actually step up their game or to try to...
Yeah, it can be, right? There are different ways of solving the problem of non-uniform goods, right? Because cows aren't uniform goods. To get back to my kind of bread example, one way that governments in the earlier period tried to solve it was by controlling the quality. So they would say it has to be X% of white flour, X% of wheat flour. That'll control what the quality is. But of course, the experience of buying a loaf of bread is that Fred's bread may be better than Sally's bread, right? And so I think that's one of the things that then fuels an interest in shopping around, in competing over quality. Of course, the problem that auctions always revealed is how imperfect everyone's information is. Maybe you can tell by looking at a cow which one's better than the other. Maybe you can tell by sniffing a loaf of bread which one's better than the other. But maybe you can't. And maybe there are people who are really good at it and people who are terrible at it. And so there are a lot of anxieties that come up around auctions about what kind of information do we have? And is someone trying to trick us? That also becomes an essential part of anxiety around auctions.
Yeah, that thought entered my mind, believe me, because market manipulation seems as old as markets. So what? Before I get too far off of this, I want to just clarify. You mentioned that auctions occurred in Europe. That was something that we brought over. Did auctions have the same impact on value setting in the European systems as they do here, or did we just really embrace it and run with it?
So I think they become very widespread. They're used in more contexts and more extensively in British North America, in part because of the colonial context. So you have, for instance, colonial governments that are interested in seizing and taking over indigenous land. Well, that's a phenomenon that you don't find in settled places of Europe. And so are you going to use mechanisms of market, mechanisms of court? How are you going to make this seem legal? Which is something that, these British authorities get interested in, right? So that's one use of auctions. The other is, in British North America, settlement is fairly dispersed. So whereas in England, for example, you have routine series of market towns, fairs. You show up at a particular time, all of the stands are there, you buy the stuff, and it's controlled, right? There's usually an officer of the market who's making sure that Fred isn't, hiding the wound on his cow's leg or whatever it is, right? But settlement in British North America is much more dispersed, and so people are buying and selling wherever they can make it happen, like at a trading post or kind of at a wharf. The problem there is that you may not have all the customers that you want, right? You want to get a bunch of people together, right, to try to bring up the price. And that's why auctions become more appealing in some of the particular characteristics of British North America.
British North America being founded almost in rebellion, well, literally in rebellion, but built around this sense of morality. Like we're better than where we came from, kind of a thing. The king is a lunatic. We know how to manage ourselves. We're going to do this right. Almost like we get a chance at a fresh start. Let's do this right, with the exception of the land grab that you just kind of alluded to, which I think a little bit later on. But did you sense that there was kind of a community element to this? Like there was that kind of morality, like that moral compass built into the system?
Well, I would say economy is always about morality. All of our ideas about, who is a deserving poor person or an undeserving poor person, that's an economic idea that's all around morality. Ideas about what's the right thing to do with money and what's the wrong thing to do with money. So I think moral parts of value are they're consistent across from the past and into the present. I think what's I think actually the imperial colonial aims of empires in the Americas, more than a desire to be good, is what's behind how these auctions operate. So, when you think about the empires of Europe, right, one of the things they want to do is they want to send ships out. They are taking African captives, they are trading for gold, and they're moving them around the Atlantic. And one of the ways that, for instance, the British government got that going is that the English crown chartered monopolies to do it. But they wrote into the charter that when you bring the goods back, you have to auction them. Because by making it open and fair and anyone can see it, that's how you show you deserved to get this monopoly. So that it gets worked into colonial practice from the beginning.
Wow. Okay, well, that certainly scrubs the notion of morality at selling people, unless was that they really didn't. Did they use this as a justification for slave trade?
Well, I don't think they tried to justify this. Many of the people who were operating the slave trade were not particularly trying to justify it beyond saying that this is a labor force that we are going to seize and trade and use in colonial expansion, in plantation growth. And they begin to use auctions, among other means, for selling enslaved people. And there are the same kinds of arguments that an auction is the best way because it allows people who are not enslaved to bid on human property. So it does get folded into these ideas about a global trade, that it's going to happen by an auction.
And it also goes a long way to establishing the notion that a certain populace has not as much value as the people who would bid on it.
Well, it's different parts of value, right? They may all be equally valuable. Some are priceable and some are not priceable. I mean, that's kind of one of the interesting things about seeing the way that auctions of human beings get folded into the legal system, get folded into appearing in newspapers, the way it gets normalized alongside all these other economic practices to make it seem normal or natural that a person could have a price put on them, which is fundamentally jarring and not logical, right? Human beings are unique individuals. They are not interchangeable commodities. So it took a lot of cultural and legal work and violence to turn brothers and sisters, for example, into commodities. And auctions are part of that process. And there's scholarship on all kinds of ways that this happened. But what I focus on in the way I'm thinking about it is how daily auctions were, right? If you look at these colonial newspapers, column after column of sales, including auction sales, including the sales of human beings. These are happening weekly or monthly on courthouse steps. They're happening in taverns. They're happening in people's houses. Just the ubiquity of where these kinds of sales are going on, selling people next to furniture, selling people next to other kinds of commodities, right? Over and over. And this repetition gets baked into an economic culture and, I would argue, warps it around even a human can be priceable. This is a legitimate way to value something, is with price. Selling a person is a way to devalue them or to monetize their humanity in order to profit off of it. The 3/5 clause that you're thinking about that's in the Constitution is at a time when slavery is still legal, but they're parceling out how you're going to count representation. So how white people are going to have power in the government. And it was a bargain between states that had a lot of enslaved people and states that didn't have a lot of enslaved people, for a way for states with a lot of enslaved people to count this population that was being treated as property. They were not being represented in the sense that we would think, that my opinion is valued, that my point of view deserves a place in politics. They were being treated as property, and yet they got to be counted as people because they were also people. I mean, it's why this is a violent and illogical core to this cluster of ideas around value, price, and human relationships.
We talked about humans up for sale and the value that's established for a certain human. And when we think of that, we always think of, black people for sale, slave trade, things like that. But that's not the only situation, right? I mean, women were once upon a time for sale.
Well, it's interesting. Free women were never for sale, but there's a way in which stories about auctions become how people talked about the uncomfortable nature of, for instance, of getting married, right? How do you distribute men and women into partners, right? And so there are a lot of auction jokes about courtship as being like an auction, and that maybe you should get a discount off an older woman or an older man. And so a lot of satire about, how much will you bid for this guy? He's looking very strapping, right? How much would you bid for this woman? So it's humor, but it's humor to touch on something very uncomfortable, which is the fact that, number one, actual human women are being bid on at the same time. And number two, in the 19th century, there's a pervasive culture of domesticity, which is arguing that free women are not about the economy. Free women are about the home, and the home has to be kept apart from the economy, because the economy is a rough place for men and competition, and we don't want that kind of competition in the home. You want to be able to relax with a nice woman presiding over it. And so actually in the beginning of the 19th century, there's a brief scandal over what are called ladies' auctions. And ladies' auctions are just a marketing ploy, right? They set up these auctions. They say, ladies, you'll be interested in buying these goods. But in newspaper debates and in kind of complaints that are written in, it's, well, if you say it's a ladies' auction, surely that means that ladies themselves are up for sale. So, this discomfort over free women as economic actors gets mapped onto discomfort over who can be priced, who can be sold, who's in the economy, who's for the economy, and who's outside of the economy. So auctions are just really good ways to tell stories about what's appropriate in the economy, in part because they're so theatrical. You can imagine ladies jostling each other at an auction. It didn't happen that way, but it's in people's imaginations. And so it's a good way for politicians, social critics, to tell stories about what is and isn't appropriate in kind of cultural shifts of the 19th century.
It's kind of a lens through which you can measure our attitudes, our collective attitudes about humanity and how we treat each other. Someone just brought up to me that women couldn't have credit cards until the 1970s or something like that, or might actually be later than that. But it's that, and it's hard for anybody who not lived through that to really appreciate that. The same way I imagine it is hard for anyone who's never seen someone on auction for their domestic value.
Yeah, I mean, it's another good thing to remember. That one thing that we do as historians is when you find jokes in the past, usually that's a good place to look for social discomfort. People tell jokes about things that are in flux, or that there's debate about, or that people are uncomfortable about. And so looking beneath the joke and around the joke to understand the fears and assumptions about the economy, about, is marriage really just a financial arrangement, right? And is that a problem? Or is that just part of how we value everything with a price? We value everything with money. Why not husbands and wives? Why is that a problem? And so when you look to the jokes, gender jokes, jokes about region or jokes about race, right? In addition to being surprised and horrified, often that's a good clue for us to try to understand where were the problems of the past.
And have you found jokes that correlate with certain epochs in our history?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea about domesticity is one of them. Why are there so many jokes about auctioning brides, right? All of a sudden, or the ladies' auction room. Who cares that, they're selling some things that might be interesting to women at a few auctions in New York City in the early 19th century? Why would you write all these newspaper articles about it? Well, you would write it about either you had your own auction and you were in competition with them, and so you wanted to talk them down in order to build up your own sales, or you're anxious. There's something going on here about money and the home and free women's roles that's popping out in these kind of jokes.
If I'm looking at auctions as a good or a bad thing, or a thing that just is, not auctions themselves, but the byproducts of auctions, like the way that they are used throughout our society, they've also been tools for economic growth or for status gains. Like if there's a specialized, if I see that something is up for auction and I can afford it and it was owned by someone famous and I can acquire that thing, it gives me that added value, and I can say, oh, that's that was owned by Frank or whatever. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another one of the dilemmas around auctioning that people talked about all the time, right? The benefit of going to, this would be like a household auction, right? So someone dies and their estate is put up for auction so that they can essentially liquidate the estate, pay off the creditors, and they disperse the goods, right? Things that, and there's a whole legal system on, what gets set aside for different people in bequests, but you're auctioning off this estate. You advertise it as being so-and-so's estate, and people can come and maybe purchase a little bit of the good life, right? That you're not going to get that whole library, but maybe you could get a few books, right? And then you can put them on a shelf, and that's a way to maybe elevate your own status. And so part of the anxiety around that is then on the fears about how was that collected. I mean, it is a fact that when an auctioneer was putting together an estate sale, if they had some other stuff to sell, they would add that into the sale, right? And so then people would be outraged, right? I paid this much money for this bottle of wine, but it hadn't been selected by this person who I respect. It was selected by some nobody, right? And so I had paid a premium. Again, we're getting back to the question of the information that people have and the assumptions that they have about the value add of something touching a famous person. And for some reason, that would make it more valuable.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is, I imagine sometimes you could just stumble into something that was more like if you ever watch Antiques Roadshow or something like that, where you're like, how much is this worth? I picked it up. It was like $5 in someone's garage, and that's like $30,000. So, I've added to my wealth exponentially from what I thought I was going. I thought I was going to gain a $5 painting or something like that. So I imagine there are those little hidden benefits in this as well.
Well, that's always the dream, right? Yeah. That you're going to find an unexpected treasure or delight. The reality was probably more, you might find something that looked good on the surface, but underneath it was something that wasn't so terrific. It's worth pointing out that people also were willing to pay more money for things that had emotional value. So bidding on goods from a neighbor who you loved or an aunt who you cared about. And people talked about that. They would go to a preview, which would be kind of like a showing before the auction. And they would look at things and say, oh my gosh, I remember when she got that set of silverware, right? It's so sad that she died only a year later, right? She didn't even get to use it. And maybe I'll get some of that silverware. So they're stories that they're telling themselves, not just about the goods themselves. I really like that silverware. I really like that pot. But again, about the relationships, the dinner they had with that person or the connection they had with that aunt. And that gets fed into how they're thinking about value too. Now, at an auction, that gets turned into a number. And that becomes a source of upset, right? So there are letters of folks writing and saying, the goods from an estate sale, didn't earn as much as we thought. And they're disappointed not only because they want more money to come out of this estate sale, but it seems somehow insulting, right? That the human value couldn't get into the price somehow, right?
Yeah, you alluded to land, like acquired land that we just auctioned off, that we've stole from Indigenous people, basically, to put fine point on it, and auctioned it off as if we had some say in what it could be, what the value could be. I can imagine there'd be a lot of anger from Indigenous people who would,
right. I mean, one of the interesting things about auctions in British North America, in colonial America, is the way auctions are used by the legal system. So civil courts use auctions as a way to liquidate estates or call in debts at a time when people didn't go around with a lot of cash. They didn't have a lot of money. So let's say, and there are laws about this, let's say you committed a crime and you got out in your oyster boat in the wrong season. So you have to pay a fine for that. Well, you don't have any money because nobody's going around with money. There isn't a circulating medium like that. Well, the sheriff will seize your boat, sell it, turn it into money. That's how you pay your fee. And that's what brings it into the legal system. During the American Revolution, patriots create laws that seize the property of people who they say are loyalists, right? An auctioneer comes in, auctions it off, redistributes it, right? So that's a way to turn something that looks a lot like plunder, maybe, or stealing from your neighbors, into a legally approved mechanism for pricing and redistribution. Similar things happen with Indigenous land. So in British history, in the British legal system, land is not liquid in the way we think of it. You're not buying and selling land on an open market. There are restrictions around how you disperse estates. And people who have seen Downton Abbey know about this. There's the entail, and that's how Cousin Matthew ends up with it, right? So there are these laws around the circulation of land. And in the colonies, they begin to, so you can't just seize land because somebody owes you money. In the colonies, they begin to force Indigenous people into debtor relations. So if there's a trade, having the Indigenous person sign a mortgage in order to back, say, a loan or a purchase on credit. And then if they don't pay, the mortgage allows the seizure of that land. Again, placing this framework of legality around capture of Indigenous land. And what happens from that legal process, by the middle of the 18th century, the British make an entirely new law only for the colonies that, yeah, you can seize land, you can seize people, right? You no longer even need the mortgage, right? So there's a progression, and you can sell it by auction. That's the way to do it. So there's a progression into how the legal system together with auctions are used to place legitimacy over these colonial aims. So it's the way we still today, we use economic tools to achieve our ends. And if the tools are official, then the action looks legal.
So I guess a lot of this has to do with the PR behind it. It's, I imagine, like around revolutionary times, it's not hard to paint the Crown and loyalists as they don't, we're doing the right thing. We're doing right by the country that we want. But and I imagine they get a lot of buy-in, save from the loyalists who would be like, it's so fast. So it is kind of that way. You could justify, not justify, I don't think you could ever justify, but you could use this to say there's some weight to slavery. There's some weight to us stealing lands from Indigenous people. There's some weight from us capturing assets from loyalists because they're traitors or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Paine says at one point, look, if we capture all the loyalist property and auction it off, that's how we're going to pay for the revolution. I mean, he was not entirely right that was enough. It was a small proportion. But, right, so there's a pragmatic aspect to it. We're going to take their land, and that's how we're going to fund our new government. But there are also these political meanings of seizing the land, seizing the property of people who are not you, right? People who are who you've decided are traitors, you decided are outsiders. That's a way to cast them out and bring together the in-group, right? And of course, this all goes down to social dynamics. And at the end of the war, there's a creation of what's called the Loyalist Claims Commission. And their job is to listen to all the loyalists who say, I owned so much valuable property and they took it. Now pay me back, because by being loyal to you, I lost all this money. And the British government says, well, prove it, right? Sure, you owned all this property, right? How do you know? And they send a guy to go and kind of try to add it all up. And it's a debacle because, you get half the letters saying, well, yeah, the neighbors bid on it, but, the neighbors were so puffed up that they paid way too high a price. It wasn't worth that. And then you get these other letters saying, no, the neighbor was his friend and so paid only a tiny amount at auction, and the other friends were in on it and they suppressed bidding, and so actually the value of it was higher than governments are also coping with this reality that these prices at an auction, they're of social relations, right? So is that bad, or is that the reality of value?
Yeah, that's the reality of value. Like, it's such an abstract concept, and I appreciate the work that you've done to establish how we got where we are. But do you see any reflection in today's economies that that owe themselves to that original thought?
Well, I do think that most of us get our ideas about economic fairness from the world that we live in, and we don't usually think about what's the history of that world. So rules around bankruptcy, that we think are fair or unfair, right? We don't think about, well, how does this even get defined? And therefore, we just think about, oh my gosh, am I going to have to declare bankruptcy? I think the same thing is true about pricing, about competition as the best way to come at a price, or competition as the best way to truly value something. I mean, we're familiar with it. If we complain, oh yeah, I paid too much for that, we aren't usually challenging the very idea that there should be a price affixed to something that is somehow linked to its value. We don't challenge that. We just think, oh, we got taken, right? So going back to fundamentals to say, well, wait a second, right? What's missing when we put a price on something? Well, it's the labor that went into it, or it's the family relationships that passed this item down through the centuries and then, sold it to somebody else. I mean, those things are things we could, or fairness, right? I mean, thinking back to, is there a limit on how much you can charge for food? Should there be a limit? Why can't a government, as they have in the past, said, no, you can't charge more than 50 cents for a loaf of bread because people need to eat, right? We've gotten away from that. That seems overbearing. It seems like a controlled market. And, we don't live in those same kind of controlled markets. I mean, our markets are controlled in other ways. But, we, like all human beings, we exist in the world that we exist in. And we take things for granted as natural or as law, kind of common laws that were constructed by humans.
I'm going to ask you to step out of your historian
Yeah.
head for just a second and work with me on this concept, because everything that you have mentioned so far comes from like price setting. It's almost, if I were looking at motivations, I would say there's a fear of scarcity.
Yeah.
That we have to address, and that's why if something, like when supply goes down or
That's right.
demand goes up or whatever, or the price goes up, stepping again out of your historian skin and putting yourself into the future, knowing now what we do know about all that we've learned just in the past century or even a couple of decades about how to manufacture more responsibly, how to provide for it. And I've heard it said several times over that we can provide all basic human essentials for everyone on the planet several times over. Food, clothing, shelter, by extension, healthcare, education, not necessarily, but we decommoditize the commodities to provide for humanity. And we can do that. Knowing that is a possibility, do you see an end of this auction established mentality of valuing things?
Well, I think there are opportunities for us to revisit how we distribute goods, right? So, I mean, we live in a modern capitalist society, and we do use price as a way to efficiently distribute goods, right? That is an idea that has led to a lot of growth, has led to many of the things that we enjoy in the United States. I think looking back on history, remembering it's not the only way to distribute goods. You can choose to prioritize other things besides efficiency. You can choose to prioritize other means of gathering people together, communities to recognize, hierarchies of needs, and how you create an economy that serves different purposes than, say, efficiency or growth. Economies can be put to all kinds of different purposes, and there are economies of goods, there are economies of affection, there are economies of relationships, and kind of understanding this broader context that we live in maybe can help us. I mean, if we're creative and if we're willing to try different things, you're right about the fear, right? We know what we know, but we don't know how it's going to turn out. In the same way that the people I study didn't know how it was going to turn out.
And I think we see that reflected at least in contemporary United States society, where there seems to be this explosion of hoarding. Like gather, keep. And
Yeah.
I can't spend $1 trillion, but it's not going to stop me from pursuing it and keeping you from that. So I'm curious, like we should, because, and I don't want to paint this as all as the negative byproduct of auctions, because there has been historically some good that's come out of this. There's been a lot of social justice that's been exercised through this. There's a story I heard you tell, and please, I'm going to ask you to tell it, about a sheriff helping families out.
Yeah, right. So in the same way that you could manipulate a sale in order to destroy your enemies, right, during the American Revolution, you could also manipulate a sale to help out a poor and starving family, right? And this is where I think also thinking about participation in the economy and participation in auctions is really interesting. So if the audience around you refuses to let other people bid up a price, maybe something would be sold for a small amount. Maybe someone could purchase back what they wanted. Maybe the example I'm going to actually give is an example from a very famous abolitionist text. Harriet Jacobs, she's a woman who escapes slavery, writes about her life once she's free, and she talks about the auction of a woman that she calls Aunt Martha. And Aunt Martha's enslaver had promised her freedom when they died, and then they died, and there were debts, and so the next generation says, no, we're going to sell you, Aunt Martha. And they say, but Aunt Martha, we'll sell you privately. We'll just sell you over here in the parlor. And what Jacobs writes is Aunt Martha said, no, if you have no shame to live up to what I was promised, we're going to do this in public, right? So she's weaponizing the public nature of what we know to be horrific. The sale of a human being is horrific. And what's interesting in this abolitionist tale is, Harriet Jacobs' character Aunt Martha is using that to publicly call out what is happening to her. And what happens at the auction is someone who knows her bids a very low price, and nobody bids against her, right? And there's kind of a dramatic scene where the auctioneer is saying, come on, we got to get money to pay off the debts. Nobody bids higher because they know what's going on. And then the woman who purchases her frees her as well. So there are these public elements of what is a horrific event that can be used in different ways, right? So abolitionists were in pursuit of social justice, and by telling stories like that, they were both calling attention to the horror of enslavement, and the slave trade. I mean, it's perfectly encapsulated in the sale of a grandmother, an aunt, right? And yet they're also suggesting ways that by bringing this into the public, the way auctions brought human commodification into the public, that's a way to condemn it. That's a way to undermine it. That's the way ultimately to destroy it.
Yeah, using the system to beat the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's ambivalent, right? I mean, and abolitionists themselves felt ambivalent about using the system, right? Can you truly use a system designed to commodify you to break commodification?
Yeah, I dare say we're kind of at that precipice now, where you see so many boycotts out there now, where people are using economy to destroy economies, or not to destroy, but to teach lessons. Like say it's not the world we want. So
it's such a powerful lever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see what shakes out of it. Is there anything that we missed that you think we all need to know about this correlation between auctions and value?
Well, I just think reminding ourselves that there's no easy link between value and price, and reminding ourselves to think more broadly about that. And then I'll get in a little plug for, it's also just interesting to learn about the different ways people bought things in the past. We've talked mainly about ascending bid auctions, which are where you call out higher and higher and higher and then sold. But in fact, they had a lot of different kinds of auctions. There were what's called mining, a Dutch auction, where you start at a high price, and then you go down and you wait and you wait and you wait and you wait until someone yells mine, and then it's theirs. There were auctions by the candle, in which you would light like an inch of candle and let it burn, and you could bid, and whoever had the bid when it snuffed out got it. And so we can think about these different types of auctions and the way they influence human dynamics in coming at a price, right? It's a different kind of psychological battle that you're doing if you're going up versus coming down versus watching this candle and trying to figure it out. And so just remembering all the sources of pricing and distribution, all these crazy elements that go into them. It's just interesting about the past, as well as being a good tale for us today.
Yeah, and I guess it's rooted in gamification.
Yeah.
If I can engage you with a new twist on this auction thing, you might participate.
Maybe you'll participate. Yeah, like me and my Duolingo.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been to Christmas parties where they've had like gift giving that's kind of like that. Like you hold on to it, but if someone can steal your gift or whatever.
Yeah, right? I mean, there's definitely a big element of gambling in here. And it's not going too far to say there's a huge element of gambling in most economic practices today as well, right?
Yeah, and if you end up at my Christmas party with the present that everybody wants, you'll see that value skyrocket if everybody's trying to steal it and how many times it's stolen. Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know why this brings me back to, have you ever read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yeah.
So, and then, Phaedrus, goes insane contemplating the concept of quality. Yeah. I see a lot of that baked into here. Someone could literally go insane contemplating the notion of value. And I think maybe we owe a debt of gratitude to auctions for helping us, at least giving us a starting point. And again, as you mentioned before, where it goes is anybody's guess. But
absolutely, a famous critic of auctions in the early 19th century said, "The depravity of the human heart is fundamentally the business of auctions." We can hope that perhaps the good in the human heart could also be what motivates our economy.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Ellen Hartigan-O'Connor. If you'd like to learn more about Ellen and her work, check out our YouTube page for links to her bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say and guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening. See you next time.